Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kaneesha Parsard, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department here at the University of Chicago. I'm really delighted to be here to share some of my work with you today, and I want to thank the staff of the Humanities Division for putting this together, and all of you here in attendance in person and on Zoom. So today my talk is titled The Friending Plot: Sexual and Economic Freedoms in Early 20th Century Caribbean Fiction. Today I'll be speaking about friending, the term in Caribbean English for casual romantic and sexual relationships, with the expectation of support and sometimes explicitly for pay. Officially, friending is defined in Caribbean English as, quote, to have an understood sexual relationship with somebody without marriage. In 1920s and 1930s Trinidad, friending as a mode of survival and of kinship among working people captured the imagination of the Beacon Group, a literary collective whose best known member was the Trinidadian social theorist and writer C.L.R. James. And this talk is drawn from my first book project, which is titled An Illicit Wage. It challenges the idea that after emancipation, wage labor would be what would make the formerly enslaved fit for freedom. After West Indian emancipation, which took effect in 1834 and more fully in 1838, colonial administrators and planters hoped that Black wage labor and newly arrived contract labor from China and India would be reliable workers. And this hope for good work was related to family life. In order to be good workers, men would support their wives and children with their pay, and in turn depend on their wives' unwaged work in the home. My book showcases the opposite of this fantasy. In West Indian colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guyana, I trace the development of a literary and visual repertoire by which West Indians and Britons cast doubt on work and domesticity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of these repertoires include the figure of the indentured Indian woman who stores her wages in jewelry as insurance against plantation and patriarchal violence, the friending plot, which I focus on today, and the legal and visual figure of the illegitimate child. An illicit wage hopes to, in this way, illuminate freedom based instead on survival, pleasure, and sharing. From here, I'll show how in C.L.R. James's 1929 short story, Triumph, friending is an act as well as a narrative plot by which working class women and men subsist as they exchange companionship for resources. As such, these stories reject the marriage plot in 18th and 19th century English women's writing, where in exchange for wealth and security, women agreed to be lifelong companions, carers, and mothers. In the colonies, instead, the Beacon Group's characters reject economic and domestic stability in favor of the pleasure and windfall of friending. I'll introduce 1920s and 1930s Trinidad and the Beacon Group, offer what I mean by the friending plot, the reception history of the story Triumph, and consider how the story's pleasures might be understood as a means of survival and not merely scandalous. So this story begins in the 1930s as West Indian working people sought to secure their future amidst a global depression and local economic crises. In 1929, Trinidad's sugar industry declared bankruptcy for the second time since the 19th century. And beyond the southern Caribbean island, the entire British West Indian industry was imperiled. If jobs were hard to come by in Trinidad, conditions were little better around the region. Overproduction had led to a global surplus and then to low prices. So too had the wages of sugar workers declined. This moment began with rumblings on sugar estates and in factories and ended with region-wide labor rebellions. But some instead lived their rebellion more modestly in the alleyways of West Indian cities. Those looking for opportunity had departed the rural cane fields where their ancestors had labored. 2 or 3 generations removed from slavery, people from elsewhere in Trinidad and from around the region found themselves in the capital city of Port of Spain. And once in the city, migrants rented rooms in so-called slums or barrack yards. This is where C.L.R. James's 1929 short story Triumph begins. The omniscient or all-seeing narrator provides an introduction in which the barrack yard is at once too narrow and too open. Quote, "Every street in Port of Spain proper can show you numerous examples of the type. A narrow gateway leading into a fairly big yard, on either side of which run long, low buildings, consisting of anything from 4 to 18 rooms, each about 12 feet square. A room would face the center of the yard where residents would dry their clothes on bleaching stones or cook. There they also shared amenities like standpipes, outhouses, and showers. Even in their rooms, the porous walls let in all manner of sounds and smells." And so I just want to draw attention to the photographs I have displayed here, which the Trinidad and Tobago Planning and Housing Commission took as they undertook slum clearance or demolition in the 1940s and 50s. They're an important complement to the fiction featuring the barrack yard because they give a sense of the size and scale of the barrack yard. And one key aspect of the photos that I want to draw attention to is the interrupted sight lines through the alleys with discarded furniture and residents shrouding themselves in dark doorways. So while the residents experienced the barrack yard as porous and without privacy, outsiders such as police or government officials found it hard to decipher. Residents would have shared the space with what one writer called, quote, "the habitually unemployed, petty criminals, prostitutes, and so-called vagrants," end quote, as well as working people making their living on factories or on the docks. None came easily by the 12 to 15 shillings for rent, but it was in this closeness nonetheless that they could experiment in survival. Amidst these conditions, the people of the barrack yard made lives by sharing resources and by giving and receiving pleasure. So the protagonist of Triumph, Amidst, is a woman living in a barrack yard in Port of Spain, Trinidad. She has seen her luck change since she came to the city from Demerara, a region of British Guyana. She is described as, quote, "a black woman with some Madrasi East Indian blood in her, and then with compliments to her hair, the size and shape of her body." This gesture not only explains her attractions to the men who might support her, but also pegs her as the ideal mixed-race figure to represent the Trinidadian masses in a diverse island colony and a region shaped by indigenous peoples, European settlers, enslaved Africans, and indentured Asians. At this moment, Amidst's position in the yard depends on whether she enjoys the affection of a man, and right now, she does not. Quote, "Amidst, from being the most prosperous woman in the yard, had sunk gradually to being the most destitute," end quote. By the end of the story, she will enjoy the affections and money of 2 men, Popo and Nicholas. In local parlance, she is friending with them. And while at this moment, the church, employers, and colonial government hope to make housewives out of working class Trinidadian women in the 20th century, Amidst will continue to support herself through entanglements with her neighbors. And so in and out of the yards of Port of Spain, a group of writers took up the mantle of social realism, sketching the folk in order to better understand themselves, not as British colonial subjects, but rather as Trinidadians. One of them was C.L.R. James. He was from a black middle-class family and distinguished himself as a student and teacher at Queen's Royal College, the premier boys' secondary school on the island. In the decade before he would migrate to England in 1932, he began to write. James reflected fondly on what he called, quote, "an intense literary cooperation with Alfred Mendez in his unpublished autobiography. Mendez, who went by Alfie among intimates, was from a rich, long-established, quote, Portuguese merchant family. And together, James and Mendez founded a journal called Trinidad and went on to publish its only 2 issues between 1929 and 1930. Their goal was to develop a West Indian literary tradition in hopes that a homegrown culture would be the foundation of an independent Trinidad. And after Trinidad became what would become the Beacon Group, James and Mendez met another man named Ralph de Boissier in 1928. They also gathered in the home of Albert Gomez, who, quote, lived among the poor and therefore provided a direct door to the Trinidadian masses. Gomez would edit the Beacon after James and Mendez concluded the short run of Trinidad, and together the group published the Beacon intermittently from March 1931 to November 1933, releasing a final issue in 1939. With its focus on local affairs, the Beacon has been heralded as, quote, the critical domain in which Trinidadian writers and essayists began to imagine a national identity against British colonial rule. But beyond the politics of anti-colonialism, there was much to learn from the Beacon Group's fiction and especially Triumph about the perspective of working class women. So to return to Triumph, long before Memitz reaches her triumph, the story stages a confrontation between the work of friending and that of the formal sector in Trinidad. Memitz goes to her friend Celestine, who believes that their neighbor Irene used obeah, an African spiritual practice, to cause Memitz's bad luck. Celestine takes on Memitz's problems and resolves to fix it. Quote, she says, I go in to talk to the agent in the morning. I go in to tell him to give you to the end of the month is only 5 days, and I go in to give you a bath, end quote. As she conducts a spiritual bath of Memitz, she cleanses her of what ails her. For the women of the barrack yard, their existence is not only determined by the invisible hand of the free market, but also by their own hands and by those hands beyond the earthly realm. And soon, this hand has delivered new friends to Memitz. She first meets Popo, whom she enjoys, not least because he resolves all of her debts. Quote, he paid the rent, he gave her money to get her bed and other furniture out of the pawn shop, and every Sunday morning, Memitz was stirring beef or pork or chicken in her pot, end quote. Meanwhile, when Memitz meets Nicholas, their arrangement is purely a practical matter. Quote, she didn't like the butcher too much, but he liked her, and a pound of beef was a pound of beef, end quote. As Memitz grows more secure, she invites the ire of her neighbor, Irene. But Irene was a jealous woman, not only jealous of her man, but jealous of Memitz's steady $3 a week and Celestine's policeman with his $28 at the end of the month. She lived with a cabman whose income, though good enough, was irregular, and he was a married man with a wife and children to support. Irene had to do washing to help her out, while Memitz and Celestine did nothing, merely cooked and washed clothes for their men, end quote. So the passage here ruminates, as Irene must, considering what she has and what she lacks. Irene keeps a close eye on her man's resources, punctuating her complaint with the concession of, though good enough. And, she continues urgently, as though to interrupt her already embittered inner voice, the cabman observes his first responsibility, not to Irene, but to his household. And she keeps an even closer eye on the money that Memitz and Celestine's keepers give them. Irene notes their resources in the form of a wage, a dollar amount, and the pay cycle. And while Memitz can regard washing or work as a cook as a second choice, something to do when there is no man around, Irene cannot support herself without washing. Here, Triumph offers a detailed vision of the friending relationship at the center of an informal economy. But the work of all 3 women, I want to suggest, is much the same, exposing the conflict of the story as a false one. So to lean a little bit more into this conflict, I'd like to think briefly about washing in this passage and in the context of the Caribbean at this time more broadly. Washing was, in the first place, one of the key occupations for Black women in the early 20th century Caribbean. The figure of the washerwoman on a riverbank is everywhere in the visual and literary culture of the Caribbean. Washing or laundry is also an act necessary to the functioning of households formed through marriage or otherwise. The washing for one's partner is not generally considered work, but rather an act of love. Rather than co-conspirators, though, rather than having solidarity, Mehmet and Celestine on the one hand and Irene on the other are made to be competitors. For these working class women, like washing, all work is contextual. The same set of demands can be waged, domesticated, or criminalized. What Mehmet and Celestine show in this case is that even the most tender acts merit compensation. So in this way, the Beacon fiction reveals friending as a relation that sees the exchange of companionship for cash in many currencies, food, or clothing. This exchange produces circular relations in what I call the friending plot. It typically begins with seduction, is sustained by the exchange of sex for money, and ends, often temporarily, with a breach of contract when the woman is suspected to be unfaithful. In friending, unlike in marriage at times, a woman sets the terms. She attracts him, she cooks and washes for him, she spends evenings with him. But with so many duties, she's bound to fall down on the job sometime. The protagonists in the Beacon Group stories sometimes desire another, or they may have need for another wage, and so find another suitor. Where one friend may cover essential needs, another may provide finery that raises the woman's reputation among her neighbors. The breach of contract, however, is not so much the infidelity itself, but the failure to conceal it, to be more subtle about it. In the end, these main characters usually win their lovers back, along with some much-needed dollars. This plot is unstable as well as circular. Rather than the bare survival that what was called the only necessary wage rate provides, the women of the friending plot enjoy the pleasure of the encounter, their needs and wants, as well as the time and leisure that formal work otherwise makes impossible. But what exactly is pleasure in this context? This sensation had long been the object of disciplines from political economy to psychoanalysis in Europe and Britain, and shaped Caribbean discourse about work and about sexuality. In the 19th century, for example, British political economists like John Stuart Mill and J.R. McCulloch argued that denying oneself pleasure through labor was the key to national prosperity. These ideas made their way to the post-emancipation Caribbean, where work secured freedom itself. But Mehmet and others clear another path. The women of this friending plot enjoy the company of the men and women who keep them and of their neighbors, but they just as often take pleasure in themselves. Pleasure is in fullness. They cook on open flames, taking on the scents of meat in their Sunday pots, and eat. Pleasure is also a pride that does not come from self-discipline. Before they leave their room to meet a friend, they often luxuriate in dressing themselves and admire their reflections. At the same time, pleasure is communal, is shared. These characters help other women feed and clothe themselves. And as theorists from Black feminists to Michel Foucault have argued, friendship often involves the giving and receiving of pleasure, and in so doing, building space for one another. The friending plot could also be known in this way as friending as a way of life. The pleasure of friending, however, runs up against an economy of language in the Beacon Group's fiction. For a body of work so concerned with sex, Alfred Mendez once insisted that submissions to the Beacon should respect sex honestly. There's little to no description of sex itself. Throughout the Beacon Group stories, this gap takes different forms: an ellipsis, a closed door, a scene change. This is purposeful. It represents pleasure by implication rather than as scintillating. For example, at the end of another Barrack Yard story, C.A. Thomasos's The Dogla, an ellipsis marks the many moments between seduction and the satisfaction of the next morning. Quote, "And the next day was bright," end quote. Before the ellipsis, "and" is not a climax or an end. Rather, it's a release valve for the plot's tension. This is both a satisfying and a frustrating opening. The lovers will, no doubt, find themselves in the cycle of conflict and reconciliation again. But before they re-enter the friending plot circle, they can dally in these bright moments. Amidst and her companions issue an invitation to sit in the yard, to listen through the gaps in the barrack yard's walls and doors, to be a voyeur of some sort. Small though it is, the ellipsis so often found in these stories is a container for not only the encounter itself, but also for even the most temporary survival. Because these women rarely see their scant resources grow, there's always the chance that this week's gift will be the last. Friending is a wager against the future for the greatest pleasure possible in the present. So, despite this relative restraint, James's story Triumph has long invited both readership and scandal. The scandal, a question about whether working people might follow a vanguard into a more dignified existence as workers, or whether a libertine lifestyle might instead triumph. So, in 1930, the Labor Leader, the newspaper of the Trinidad Working Men's Association, published scathing reviews of Triumph in successive issues. And these reviews are documents I encountered during my research in the West Indian newspaper collection at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. The first appeared on Saturday, February 1st, 1930 in the current literature column. The unnamed reviewer, perhaps the editor, described James's achievement as bringing, quote, to light and to public attention a most deplorable set of affairs as regards the morals and living conditions of a large section of this community, end quote. They go on to express concern that women like Amidst are the domestics and nurses who rear the children of the middle and upper classes. For readers like these, it was important that James lay bare these realities in fiction, but equally important that its characters don't become surrogate mothers to Trinidadian society at large. Decades later, the CLR James papers at the University of the West Indies reveals that James would warn a friend, the Trinidadian literary critic Kenneth Ramchand, that Triumph was a story, quote, most unsuitable for children, end quote. If to these readers, social realism is not only documentary but also visionary, Triumph is a disturbing present that threatens to reproduce itself. 1 week later, reader Emile Camille joined in the objections, writing in defense of the working classes. Camille compared the barrack yard women characters, quote, to the immoral women, prostitutes, and whores as depicted by writers of the older civilizations, end quote. He indicted Triumph for its, quote, libel on its barrack yard characters, end quote. The readership of the Labor Leader, though it sought to represent working people, both slandered and defended them through an appeal to middle-class values. Contemporary critics of the Beacon fiction have in some ways echoed this review, regarding the barrack yard characters as needlessly vulgar or merely an exploited class. Even Du Boisier of the Beacon group himself lamented that the group didn't regard the barrack yard as a site for revolutionary thought and action. He said, quote, to write of the mores of the poor was as far as most of us went. We did not reach the stage of making workers the heroes in the struggle against the employer. Belonging to our time, we agreed that form was paramount, not ideas, end quote. So from this perspective, the Beacon Group's ideas were in their editorials, especially their contributions to debates on the rights of women. In 1930, the British government had introduced the divorce bill into the Trinidadian legislature. While Catholic French Creoles in the colony opposed the measure, the Beacon writers joined the conversations with editorials as well as flyers and graffiti across Port of Spain. Their position was that women should have the right to leave unhappy marriages and to challenge their husbands for alimony and property. These benefits, though, would have only extended to middle and upper class Christian women, as many could not afford to divorce or to marry in the first place, and Muslim and Hindu marriage in the colony would not be fully recognized until the 1940s. So, as the Beacon became a key outlet for the advocacy for the divorce bill, the publication's fiction seemed to support their editorials by merely shocking their readers. But Beyond what the writers themselves believed of their fiction, I believe that the values of Mehmet and the other characters were the foundation of another kind of struggle. Their own characters were a mystery to them. In an interview late in life, C.L.R. James reflected on writing the explosion of the barrack yard, as he put it, a new world after a sheltered upbringing and education. This suggestive metaphor implies that James and the Beacon writers neglected women's pleasures in favor of not only their own political and aesthetic priorities, but also their own titillation. So back to Triumph again. As Mehmet makes her way, she runs into trouble. She wonders how she will devote enough time to both of her new friends, Popo and Nicholas. Nicholas expects more of Mehmet than would the typical friend, not only companionship and pleasure, but also the promise that she will not see anyone else. But Nicholas can never be convinced that she will be faithful, and in this uncertainty is violent toward Mehmet. Meanwhile, Popo represents the attractions of the informal economy. His style is as casual as the work he does, or doesn't do, for that matter. So he has never done a week's honest work in his life. He can get $30 for you if you are in difficulties at 120% first month's interest and his commission taken out in advance, or $3,000 if you have a house or a cocoa estate. During the cocoa crop, he lurks by the railway station with an unerring eye for peasant proprietors who have brought their cocoa into town and are not quite certain where they will get their best price. This is his most profitable business, for he gets commission both from the proprietors and from the big buyers. So this description of Popo as lender and as loan shark and hustler is a strange pitch, cautionary and hopeful in turn. What begins with a warning is swiftly forgotten, turning to the seduction of his newest debtor, quote, "He can get $30 for you too." But the steep terms of the agreement punctuate the opportunity. The warning resumes in the ultimate cautionary tale, the cocoa farmers that Popo ensnares at the railway station, underpaying for their stock. Popo is, in this way, the paradigmatic man of the barrack yard. He does not pursue honest work even as he leaves the waning plantation. So Popo is the ideal partner for Mehmet in some ways. They're compatible in manner and in their strategies to survive during difficult times. Meanwhile, a report from the Wages Advisory Board of Trinidad and Tobago points to the significance of friending against formal work. The board insisted in 1936, close to the end of the Beacon's run, that employers should no longer pay a family wage. The rationale was that married men and single men alike often provide for women and children. Economic analysis, as they said, should from this point center on the, quote, laborer as the unit and not the family, end quote. The board noted this without interest in what they called the morality of other arrangements, which enshrined informal Caribbean family forms such as friending into British colonial policy, perhaps for the first time. But with the Beacon fiction, the board was not the very first group to make this observation in print. As James and his fellow writers lived in and wrote about barrack yards, this distinction between the individual and the family wage didn't yet exist. It's important to note that beyond the responsibility of the masculine worker to his women and children, the board cannot imagine an arrangement like friending being waged itself. So where any man uses his wage to support a woman outside his family, the formal wage then paradoxically supports the informal sector. In this light, women who friend, women like Mehmet, are siphoning from the necessary wage rate, undermining the economic foundations of the family, industry, and colony. So, at the climax of Triumph, it is time for Mehmet to cash in on her friending with both Nicholas and Popo. But her neighbor Irene wishes to expose Mehmet's strategy, inciting Nicholas's jealousy and returning Mehmet to her place as the most destitute woman in the yard. As Irene turns her attention to Mehmet's room, her senses, quote, are tuned by resentment and hate to their highest pitch, end quote. The sensorial metaphor suggests that Irene wishes to see and to hear all so that she can report Popo's presence to Nicholas. To use another Trinidadian English term, Irene is macoing Memets, or minding her business. After Celestine allays Nicholas's fears about Memets's other friends, she retires to Memets's room. There, Memets and Celestine spend much of the afternoon. Meanwhile, another neighbor brings gifts from Nicholas to Memets's room. First, ingredients for dinner, then a new coal pot, and then increasingly smaller packages. Over and over, one of the two women opens the door a crack to accept a package and then closes it. The barrack room door is the hinge on which the friending plot swings. At last, Memets and Celestine open the doors to reveal Nicholas's gifts. As it turns out, the neighbor was a teller of sorts, exchanging and then fetching the, quote, $5 green notes, red $2 notes, and blue dollar notes, all government notes that they then affixed to the door. Memets and Celestine laugh at Irene as they display the windfall. At this point, Irene's senses, once tuned to their highest pitch, fail her as she can only estimate the money on the door. Quote, there must be about 40, no 50, more spread out on the door, end quote. Only Memets' friends acting as broker and teller, and Nicholas can tally the money. These bankers have closed shop. These many forms point to how Trinidad and the broader Caribbean are in flux between labor regimes, industries, monetary systems, between being governed and self-government. Memets and her neighbors are taking advantage of these gaps between systems. Finally, Irene is overwhelmed. Her reaction captured again in free indirect discourse because she has, quote, neither spirit nor voice to reply. Her senses have failed her. The door has opened to Irene only to be closed again. And as the story draws to a close, Memets uses her earnings to treat the entire yard, except Irene, to a day at the beach. If only Irene hadn't put Memets in harm's way, she might have shared in the windfall. This triumph is not only in Memets' gain, but also that hers are wages for friends. So to conclude, if Memets' triumph is satisfying, her philosophy is made communally with her neighbor and co-conspirator Celestine. I'll return to the story once more to a moment in which Popo asks Celestine if she would ever like to get married. Without fanfare, almost staccato, Celestine replies, I go be a perfect slave, I are right as I be, end quote. With the force of the verb phrase I be, Celestine distinguishes between herself, a woman who subsists through sex, and a wife. Celestine also speaks to history, wielding a metaphor in Trinidadian English. If slavery has been done for a long time, she will not be a slave in marriage either. So Celestine, Memets, and the women of the Beacon fiction refuse the relations of husband and wife, of employer and worker, in favor of a community of friends. The striving so central to work and to marriage is not part of this vision. In its place is satisfaction, slowness, and stillness, punctuated though it is by conflict and violence. Just as Celestine helps Memets weather difficult times, she shares her philosophy for Caribbean working people, one in which they are simply all right as they be. Thank you.
Do we have any questions in the room?
Thank you. The story may not address it, but as far as the phenomenon itself, where do children factor in the marriage plot versus friending plot, and where are they better off in one situation or another, and how are women's strategies to welcome or prevent children from coming into their lives a part of this?
That's a great question, and a question I get quite often. So what I've found in my research on the Beacon fiction is that there are almost no children in the stories, no young characters. I suspect that if in a social sense, if there were children in these environments, they would be raised communally between family members across many generations or between friends. And I also suspect that the women in these situations would have used long-standing strategies to control their reproduction by using floral or plant-based abortifacients in some cases to prevent pregnancy or to end pregnancy. And so I think that there is a kind of fear around children, as you may have heard in the talk, that hangs about the Beacon fiction, where readers are often concerned about the fate of the children raised in these situations. I think they would certainly have been exposed to disease or experience poverty or starvation. But what I suspect too is that they would have been surrounded by a lot of love through biological and other forms of family. So thanks so much.
I may be way off base. I'm thinking of income taxes. If they had taxes on income, and if there were considerations for lower tax rates if a person was married with children. Do you know that to be the case or not?
I am not quite sure, but it's a great question that
My thought is the government would benefit if they didn't marry. And I wonder if the government was sort of colluding with society to discourage marriage if it resulted in greater tax revenues.
That's a really interesting question, and I think I'll have to return to some tax histories from this period. What I do know is that there was a sense of colonial development and welfare policy that strove to make working class Caribbean women, in particular housewives. They call it housewiffication. And so what I argue is that this is part of a much longer effort of Caribbean colonial governments and of the British imperial state to make the working classes more orderly, more respectable by going to formal work, working for wages, and also by forming families. So it's possible that this social drive worked against the financial interests of the colony. But you raise a great point, and I'll have to investigate that further.
I know you said that Triumph is like from an omniscient narrator, and I was wondering if there are any friending plot stories from one specific character's point of view, and if those reveal like to what extent you would choose like a friend based on levels of independence and like factors like that versus for the person themselves, or does it just depend?
That's a great question. So most of the Beacon Group stories are told through this third-person omniscient or all-seeing narrator, but nonetheless, it tends to travel between the perspectives of many characters. I think in many ways we're supposed to root for Mehmet in this story, but in teaching this story in the spring, one of my students really raised an important point, which is that although Irene appears to be a villain, in many ways she's being let down by the conditions of the global Great Depression, of the local conditions in the colony. And so it serves us better ethically, morally in some ways to feel for Irene just as we root for Mehmet. I think we see a lot of the same motivations or desires across the stories. Many of these women protagonists want a balance between independence and stability. And so most of the conflicts are conflicts of this sort where they're seeking to please their suitor while also running around and doing what they'd like otherwise. Thanks.
What year did the colonization end?
Oh, so Trinidad and Tobago got its independence in 1962. So this is about 3 decades before independence. But in the 1920s and 30s, there was a really growing drive for anti-colonial politics. So you see not only the formation of literary and cultural magazines as a kind of cultural foundation for independence, but also the formation of political parties that would become the foundation for independent politics after 1962.
And I'm just curious, the friending plot, possibly not a viable option for a lot of people. So I'm guessing I know the answer to this question, but do you want to spell it out for us?
Sure. So
I don't know.
I think I have a sense of what you mean, and thank you for asking. So, I mean, what you see in the stories and what, I hope you've seen from the talk is that the women who are engaging in friending have benefits from it. Like I said, independence, but also a bare sense of stability. They can pay their rent, they can feed themselves, have nice clothes for dances occasionally. But often they experience a lot of violence. And so a subplot in a lot of these stories is not only in a kind of, wacky way, running around trying to escape the notice of their lovers, but also healing from beatings, unfortunately, and kind of nursing themselves to health with the help of their friends. So, I think what this shows us is that there are no easy choices for working class women in these environments. They might friend for survival. They might work formally by working as washerwomen, as domestics. They might be unemployed altogether. But there are really no easy choices. That's a great question. Yeah.
Do you know what percentage of the population of women friended versus married?
No, I don't. And the reason for that is that at this time, I've looked at some pieces of employment data during this period. There are hard numbers for women working and men working in various professions. And then there are large percentages, close to 60% at this time, who are simply classified as variously unemployed. And so my sense is that many women or men who are hustling for survival are included under that variously unemployed category. And so in many ways, that's why I go to fiction, to understand the landscape of this informal economy, because it escapes attempts to measure or apprehend it. Question. Cool. Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for your questions. They were really excellent.